What is tradition? Tradition is a problem for us as long as we don't accept the solution that is provided for it by the doctrine or even the ideology of historicism. Now, historicism was represented and defended at its root most distinctly by the philosopher Martin Heidegger. In his Being and Time, Heidegger writes, "When tradition thus becomes master, it does so in a way that what it transmits is made so inaccessible, proximally and for the most part, that it rather becomes concealed. Tradition takes what has come down to us and delivers it over to self-evidence. It blocks our access to those primal sources from which the categories and concepts handed down to us have been in part quite genuinely drawn. Indeed, it makes us forget that they have had such an origin and makes us suppose that the necessity of going back to those sources is something which we need not even understand." And Heidegger goes on, speaking of Dasein, as being there as what he understands man to be. Now, Dasein has had its historicality so thoroughly uprooted by tradition that it confines its interest to the multiformity of possible types, directions, and standpoints of philosophical activity in the most exotic and alien of cultures, and by this interest it seeks to veil the fact that it has no ground of its own to stand on. Consequently, despite all its historiological interest and all its zeal for an interpretation which is philologically objective, quote unquote, Dasein, we could even say modern man, let me get back to Heidegger's words, Dasein no longer understands the most elementary conditions that would enable it to go back to the past in a positive manner and make it productively its own. Okay, so what does Heidegger say here? He says that all those who are dedicated to disciplines of study, to sciences that are not philosophy proper today, are lost. They don't know what they're doing. In fact, they are concealing, through their appeal to science, they're concealing the historicality or historicity or instability of their own standpoint, of their own ground. They're standing as if there were some solid ground beneath them. In reality, there is none. So they're pretending to be objective. And a sign of this pretension is they're going around, whether looking at foreign, exotic cultures or up in the sky, in deep space, they're looking out of their own immediate context, far away from it, pretending to be scientific, objective, pretending to speak on behalf also of reason, which they understand to be in continuity with a long tradition of rationalism, of reason, of science. So we're being all scientific. That is absolute trash when you consider the absence of a solid ahistorical ground beneath the scientist. So the scientist is escaping, it has this will to escape his mortality, the groundlessness of his position, of his scientific stance. All right. So, that tradition of reason, science, is ungrounded, therefore all of its claims are mere pretenses. Now, the tradition of science is thus vain, is thus essentially an impostor. All right, is that what tradition is all about? The philosophical scientific tradition. Is it ungrounded? Or does it have a ground that Heidegger is not considering, that is not doing justice to? Is the tradition grounded in history, in the lack, therefore, of a solid ground, permanent features of reality? Or, the other way around, is that tradition of reason, of discourse, grounded in natural reason? Is it grounded in a faculty that is natural to man as man and that is tied directly to the fundamental features of reality? So this is the core problem that we face when we question historicism. Now, if we look at the term tradition, tradere in Latin means, well, to give across, to transmit, tradare. Now, in the Gospels, we know that there is a traitor, someone who betrays Jesus. That's Judah. Now, Judah betrays Jesus for silver coins, for money. He betrays truth, the ground of the tradition of Christianity. He could be considered a Christian without Christ. He has traded or translated or even transmitted the tradition. He is involved in a transmission, in a betrayal, same term etymologically, without truth. There is no truth that is being transmitted. What is being transmitted, therefore? Well, essentially, truth has been converted into cash. And language is no longer a language of truth, but of, well, exchange. Exchange that is the exchange of merchants, but without foundation, without concern for honor, without consideration for truth itself. So we have a mercenary. The mercenary betrays the truth. He therefore can engage in a transmission without truth. Now, transmission without truth is a tradition without a core. So there is no truth that is being transmitted at the core of the outer transmission of words. Now, when Heidegger considers tradition, he considers only the outer shell of the transmission. And so he says, well, when, again I repeat, returning to his words, when tradition thus becomes master, it does so in a way that what it transmits is made so inaccessible now, etc., etc. So what, according to Heidegger, does tradition originally transmit? Well, it transmits the self-evidence of the lack of grounding, the historicality of Dasein, of our being there, of our being thrown into the world in Heidegger's terms. So, the truth that tradition transmits is none other than the lack of reason, lack of order, lack of reason. That is a big problem. If we look at Christianity, the Gospels of Christianity, the good news, what we see is truth identified with reason or logos. There is no truth aside from reason, and there is no reason aside from truth. Thus, reason here is understood not as mechanical reason, but as a living reason, the living word or logos. What does this tell us about tradition? Tradition will have indeed a doctrinal aspect, but this doctrinal aspect will have continuity only to the extent that it will remain the outer shell sustained by an inner core. So there will be a continuity of one and the same truth throughout the outer tradition. So the outer tradition can change, but always in function of this inner core tradition. Whenever three of you meet in my name, I will be there, says the Logos truth. Thus, there is continuity. There is a permanent substratum to the outer tradition. And this permanent substratum could be called constant dialogue, dialogos. Logos that is going across people, that is bringing people together at the core. So we are in fundamental dialogue in this logos, which is natural or innate to the human being. Thus we could say it is natural reason itself in its consummate fundamental sense. Thanks to this natural reason, or this constant, innate logos that connects us, we can have an outer shell of a tradition. In other words, we can have various authors, we could consider the various terms, even as they are modified from author to author, given the modification of the situation. Obviously, we have to face at every time, at every given moment, slightly distinct, peculiar situation, and so we alter our formulations depending on our situation. Well, that altering will be limited by, and always relative to, this continuity in the substratum, this permanence, this solidity, if you like, of natural reason, of a logos that connects us at a fundamental level. Heidegger rejects that fundamental tradition. He writes as if it were dead. So his take on tradition is that of Nietzsche, when Nietzsche turns to morality, biblical morality, and he says, well, biblical morality is dead because God is dead. He takes the death of God for granted. Heidegger looks at the death of God and he sees it as mirroring the death of a fundamental tradition that could ground the outer shell of tradition. Instead of that fundamental reason, he sees unreason, historicality, the groundlessness of Dasein, of our being thrown there. We are lost, and there is no original blessing. We are fallen without there having been a place where we've fallen from. So there is an original fall, but there is no original blessing. Where did we fall from? That is our condition of fallenness. We are as if we had fallen from somewhere. But in reality, that is our natural condition. Our fallen condition becomes our original condition, which is, a doctrine, a precept indeed, that is very much characteristic of modernity. Modern jurisprudence, modern anthropology considers the human condition as grounded in, our present existence. It therefore sees man in terms of a genealogy and not in terms of an essence. The essence is absorbed in the genealogy. The genealogy or the generation of man becomes the essence. This is what Heidegger espouses, a doctrine that he represents, to which he tries to give a philosophical dignity. And this is a doctrine that has influenced just about all disciplines today, all enterprises, all, shall we say, efforts to acquire knowledge. Our understanding of the world, of the human being, is, by and large, historicistic in those terms. And our understanding of tradition is indebted to the impact that the doctrine or ideology of historicism has had on us. We see tradition as haplessly destroyed in time. By what? Perhaps it was corrupt at its core. It had nothing to stand upon. So we need to return to the sources of a tradition. The sources. What are those? The sources, for Heidegger, had not understood themselves adequately. They had a glimpse of what was going on, but Heidegger has a better glimpse because he sees the source in the light of a tradition that builds on them. So he sees the magnified consequences of a misgiving in those sources. The early people, the founding fathers, as it were, of the tradition were mistaken. They saw something better than the rest of the people who came later did, but still they didn't see things as they are. In other words, they didn't quite appreciate the historicality of their grounding, of their own condition. Heidegger, as an historicist, supposedly does. So here we find ourselves faced with two alternatives. The modernist, ultimately historicistic, Heideggerian position. What do? We want to vindicate our historicity and thus our creativity as historical beings, so we can create traditions, but these traditions must reflect our groundlessness, which at once is our creativity. Or, and here's the other alternative, we see that there is a continuity, there is a reason in the outer shell of tradition. So if we look at civilization, we see that there are various sources. On the surface, they sometimes contradict each other. But then if we study them carefully, we see that they all share a certain foundation. Now that foundation is not of the order of a doctrine, doctrinal formulas, right? Mathematical equations or patterns or algorithms. That foundation is what Christianity would call the living word. So the living word, or the logos that is alive as dialogos, as something that is binding our beings, our lives together, that is the raison d'être, the reason for the outer shell, the spirit, the élan vital, as some would call it, this breath of life of the outer shell, and a reason for that outer shell to be there and for us to take care of it, for us to cultivate it, for us to keep it alive or keep it open in that sense to the foundation. So what does Heidegger do? He says, well, let's break the shell so we can discover that there's no reason to it. And some, such as Leo Strauss, saw the outer shell and they said, well, instead of breaking it, let us nonetheless dust it a bit, adjust it a bit, so that now we can begin seeing through it, right, the source, the reason, the natural reason. If we can access that reason, then we can appreciate that tradition. We can see that tradition was, in an important sense, poetic tradition. That yes, it contained discordant elements, apparently discordant anyway, practically inevitably discordant elements on the surface, but that this discord among these elements was a factor that helps us return to the core, to the source, to the foundation. So the contradictions on the surface help us think or expose ourselves, return to the living foundation of the tradition. And that living foundation is itself, we could say, a secret tradition, in the respect that there is a transmission of life that goes not as the outer core does, but that goes from the beginning to the end without departing from itself. And this is incidentally the key to a proper understanding of the medieval doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing. There is an emanation at stake. The emanation of the world comes about through the departure of the origin from itself back to itself without departing, without mutating, without moving. So there's a coming out of itself back into itself. So this doctrine of creatio ex nihilo is a doctrine that represents most vividly this core of the tradition, and it is itself reproposed in the doctrine of the Trinity. For indeed, there is a dialogue that is eternal between the Father and the Son through the Holy Spirit, the Holy Ghost, and there is a going from one to another through itself, through the Spirit itself of the Father. And so there's no departure. Within departure, there's no real departure. There is a self-giving within itself. So these formulations suggest that there is a continuity, a transmission that is secretive, that is esoteric, that is hidden, that is sacred, that constitutes the foundation of a civilizational tradition, a tradition that we can defend in the light of its core, against its detractors, those who see it as grounded in nothing but pretense. So those who would agree with the betrayer of Jesus in the Gospels and say, look, there is a tradition, but we don't have any truth. What is the foundation of the tradition? Mercenary exchanges. We will have trade as the foundation, and therefore we can also have merchants in the temple. And of course, the Gospels indicate that that tradition, that transmission based on a betrayal of truth as logos, dies. It is suicidal. So is the case with Heidegger's and modern in general attempt to establish traditions not as what has been called logocentric, but in fact as grounded in the absurd, or in absurd creativity. That's where we stand today. This is the challenge that we face today. Shall we devote ourselves to suicide as a civilization, or shall we recover the pietas, thus also the honor and the reverence characteristic of traditional civilization, a reverence and an honor that necessarily remain open to a core. Truth as a tradition of, well, what is being transmitted? Eternal being. Eternal being from itself back to itself. This is the traditional formulation, but if we want to understand that formulation, we must return to this dialogue that ultimately is grounded in eternal being and goes back to eternal being.